Hello and welcome to Bookish. Today I wanted to talk about a subject that's really important to me. A subject that I studied when I was getting my graduate degree, and a subject that has kind of led to some of my personal successes and meeting some of my personal goals, and it has to do with books, obviously, because this is my channel, and this is my BookTube channel. So the subject I want to talk about today, and I'm kind of going to do a series on this, is I want to talk about I want to talk about American World War I fiction and literature. And so I wanted to talk about American authors whose some of their most important works or earliest works were works related to World War I and the impact the war had on them. I'm limiting this discussion to authors who in some way participated in the events of World War I, who were soldiers or were auxiliary personnel on the battlefields or around the battlefields of World War I. And one reason for that, why I wanted to do this, was to kind of draw some attention to some of those American writers and their experiences and the books that they wrote about World War I, and B, to kind of break through that really, what I think is a really powerful barrier that is represented by Eric Maria Remarque's book, All Quiet on the Western Front. That became, when it was published, became the monumental work of fiction about World War I, but Remarque was a German soldier and not an American soldier. So I want to talk about American soldier writers, American soldier authors, and the books that they wrote about World War I. And then the last reason I wanted to talk about it is because World War I is one of my favorite historical topics, and I think that war and its importance in American history is really underappreciated. And what I would say, just as a general idea about World War I and its impact on the United States and the world was, it was a really disillusioning event. From the point of view of the world, it seemed like before World War I, that progress in technology and science were making the world a better place. There were many who believed the horrible weapons and technology that were being developed before World War I would make World War I so horrible that no one would want to fight it, that no nation would willingly engage in that kind of warfare or in that conflict. And then when the war began, and particularly because of the really dehumanizing conditions of World War I, and the fact that technology meant that a lot of the romantic notions that people had about World War I were destroyed. World War I really eliminated a lot of those, what I almost call pre-modern ideas about heroism and warfare and, kind of the glory of combat and war in lots of ways. These are obviously represented in a number of works by British writers and French writers. British poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and others wrote a lot of poetry which was really hard-hitting about the impact of World War I on them. But like I said, I wanted to talk about American authors who participated in World War I and came back to the United States and wrote books about their experiences. And the first author I wanted to talk about was John Dos Passos, and I wanted to focus my attention on his novel, Three Soldiers. So Dos Passos, like a lot of young American men, kind of, I think, saw World War I, or the Great War, as an adventure. So even before the United States became involved in World War I, he, like a number of other notable people, Hemingway, E. Cummings, and others, decided to go to France and participate in the ambulance corps there as a non-combatant. Dos Passos did that. He was a witness to the Battle of Verdun. Was quite possibly one of the most terrible conflicts, individual battles in human history. And when the war was over, he came back to the United States and he published two books. The first book he published was called One Man's Initiation, which is kind of a fictionalized accounting of Dos Passos' own experiences. And then, in 1921, he published Three Soldiers. Now, Three Soldiers, when it was published, was really controversial, and it was really groundbreaking in its content and its approach to war. H.L. Mencken, when he reviewed Three Soldiers in 1921, essentially said that Three Soldiers had forever destroyed uh, American people's notion of war, and all those old ideas about warfare and heroism and glory were set aside or were put to rest by this novel. The novel faced a lot of censorship efforts. A lot of people didn't want Three Soldiers to be published because it portrayed war and American soldiers and their behavior and their attitude towards war in what a lot of people thought were really unpatriotic and dangerous ways. So the book faced some censorship issues, but it was finally published in 1921, and when it was published, it was groundbreaking, and it did. H.L. Mencken's review might have contained some hyperbole about its impact on how we think about war, but it did really set the stage then for, in the early 20s, a whole slew of novels which looked at war differently and kind of looked at war in a really realistic way. Three Soldiers basically follows the story of three soldiers who were involved in World War I. The first one of those soldiers, his last name is Fuseli, and Fuseli gets involved in the war at a relatively young age to prove that he is not a coward. His interest in the war is really more about how people think about him and impressing people. And he's a fairly miserable character who really hates anyone with power. He hates, fears, and kind of simultaneously admires and begrudges people who have power, and he is a miserable and a poor soldier. The second soldier in the story's last name is Crisfield. Crisfield enlisted or volunteered to join the war effort because he was a small-town businessman, and he was told that if he did not enlist and participate in World War I, that his business would suffer, that everybody would think that he was a coward and no patriot. And so he enlists for that reason, and he is a hate-filled individual, and he is resentful, and the book's published in 1921, so I'm going to give you a spoiler. He ends up killing an officer out of that hatred, and Crisfield essentially then spends the rest of the novel worrying about being caught. He doesn't really express any guilt about what he's done. He's just fearful of being caught. And then the last character's last name is Andrews. Andrews is a sensitive young man. He's a thoughtful young man. And he is, like a lot of young men, I think, unsure about the justness of the war, unsure that the war is necessarily right or a good thing, but he feels like he should participate, and he is almost constantly questioning the system in some way, whether the system is the military and military discipline, military training, whether the system is, the political system and the international system that got us involved in the war. He's constantly questioning that. He falls in with another character who's not one of the original three soldiers listed. I believe his last name is Henslow, and Henslow is AWOL, and Andrews falls in with him, and he ends up going AWOL accidentally just because he doesn't have his papers. He's caught. He's assigned to a work detail of prisoners of American soldiers who were AWOL and taken prisoner, and he continues to question the war and the political system and all those kind of things as well. Those are the three soldiers. Now, I don't know if you notice this or not, but patriotism is not a part of any of those three men's reasons, really, for joining the war. They joined for personal reasons, and their involvement had little to do with patriotism. The reason why this is an important thing to note is that up until the publication of Dos Passos' novel, Three Soldiers, the official spin in the United States of America of lots of people was that the United States had been involved in a glorious cause, setting Europe free, and as Woodrow Wilson would have said, making the world safe for democracy. I have a copy of a really old book called Winning a Cause. These are World War I stories, and this is a really awesome book which is published before Dos Passos' Three Soldiers. This book was published in 1919, and the book essentially is all about the glories of the war, and there's all this post-war propaganda about the Germans in comparison to the Americans. So just to give you some idea about the propaganda in it, it said to the American, this book says, in the description of American soldiers under the heading "The Yank," it says, "To the American soldiers, the Yanks, and to the American people, the war was a job, a most disagreeable one, but one that must be done. No one else was ready and able to do it, so they went at it smilingly and jolly to every one with whom they came in contact." This makes the American soldiers seem like, duty-bound, happy warriors. And if you contrast that with what I told you about the characters in Three Soldiers, you'll see how Three Soldiers, makes a liar out of books and propaganda like that. And the truth of the matter is, Three Soldiers does help usher in a period of real questioning of American involvement in World War I. So Dos Passos goes on to write a really important series of novels called the USA Trilogy, which were really innovative and groundbreaking and more than a little bit socialist and pro-union in their outlook. Those are actually really innovative and good books, and I would encourage you to read some of Dos Passos' USA Trilogy. Those are better books than Three Soldiers is. Three Soldiers, I think, is more interesting for its historical relevance rather than for its literary quality. But the USA Trilogy and Manhattan Transfer, which is another one of Dos Passos' most famous books, were really important works at the time, even though today they're very little known. Three Soldiers is the first one of the American novels about World War I, written by an American involved in World War I would talk about, but I do want to point out that there is a real difference between the books and works written by authors like Dos Passos and Hemingway and Cummings about World War I, who were involved in the ambulance corps and therefore not actual combatants, and the works written by actual World War I combatants. Their novels of the American soldiers who actually did the fighting are much different in tone and much grittier and much more realistic. This book at the time in 1921 was praised for being realistic and gritty in its approach to World War I, but if you read it, you'll find out there's actually very little discussion of the fighting of World War I in the book and World War I combat, and that in part is because that's something that Dos Passos didn't have direct experience of and only experienced as a non-combatant. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first kind of episode in the series I want to do about American World War I writers. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching.